All right. Welcome to the Gina's live stream. This is something that we do every Sunday morning at 8:45 Pacific Standard Time. And the general format that we follow is we start off with some general beer news, things that are happening in the beer industry, as well as news that is happening around our brewery, new things, fun ingredients, fun yeast, I guess, this week, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we go on to a beer of the week and finish off with a couple discussion topics and then open that up to general questioning. So that is our format for our live stream. As for you out there that are actually going to be listening to our podcast in the future, then we followed that same format. Ryan wanted us to do a double thing, right?
Yeah, you got to do.
Okay.
For those of you tuning in to the podcast, welcome to the Genius Brewing Podcast.
Okay, so for those of you tuning into the podcast, welcome to the Genius Brewing Podcast. This is something that we do every Sunday and try to publish that up on our website. We generally start out with a format of some beer news as well as Genius news, followed by a beer of the week. And then we go into some discussion topics and finish that up to open questioning. So welcome and enjoy. Seltzers are a thing, obviously, especially during the sort of quarantine type situation we're in. I think that's only pushing them even harder because while they might not sell as well in a tap room, when you're going to the store and you're pulling something off the shelf for a hot summer day, hard seltzers are a pretty easy choice for most people.
And the entire U.S. is actually going into a health craze. A lot of people are thinking about doing things a little bit more outside and active. You're seeing beer companies like Athletic Beer Company hit it pretty big. Yeah. That is a non-alcoholic beer company, which is, from what I've heard, is pretty good. So if you guys are interested in us trying some of that beer, let me know because I think that'd be pretty exciting.
Let us know.
Low-cal beers are becoming a thing.
Low-cal beers. And speaking of health beers, electrolyte beers are also a thing, which is hilarious. So this is the next thing I found. An article about Craft House Brewing coming out with a beer that they're calling Electrolyte IPA. And I'm going to straight up call them out on this because, so this is the quote of from them. So it has, quote, electrolytes of sodium, potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate to ensure you keep on keeping on, unquote.
So what I'd be really curious to find out is actually the amount that's in these, because for those of you who don't know what electrolytes are the things that make your brain communicate with the rest of your body pretty much. They go in between your actons and dendrites and serve as what carries electrical signals through voltaic potential. But that's going to be your salt, standard sodium chloride. Yeah. Your potassium is going to be a big one. Of course, bicarbonate and calcium, like was mentioned. But in electrolyte drinks, those are there at a very high concentration, like way higher than like Goza level amounts of salt, which is why a lot of electrolyte drinks actually taste pretty salty if you don't have the flavor and the sugar to back those up.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of call them out because all those exist in water.
Yeah, they're in every beer for
pretty much
high concentrations.
Yeah, every beer has some concentration. Especially, I don't even think bicarbonate is considered an electrolyte.
No, it is.
That's literally just hardness.
Bicarbonate is an electrolyte. It actually works with, so it creates alkalinity at certain ends of your, what are they, dendrites? So basically it's used through proton pumps to make it so that there's a negative spot somewhere and a positive spot somewhere else, which is what shoots the electrical signal.
Either way, it's very silly. It's something that exists already in every single beer. And while I get their whole marketing thing,
it's the same thing as the low-cal IPA. That came out after the Brute IPA, and that's what it is.
It's very.
Oh, I missed it. Dang it.
Good job. Further win.
I was going to transfer that. I was trying to pull. I was solving the world's problems here.
Yeah, it's a very empty statement in my opinion. It's where I bet you more likely than not there's not elevated levels of any of those other than typical
not to the point
water
where it really do too much to you.
Yeah.
I mean a good amount, like in a Goza, that does play a role. Like you'll get less dehydrated drinking Gozas all day than you will from drinking beer without that level of salt for sure, because it helps your body absorb water. But they say in the article, they say that the tough part is finding the balance of a light or a low-cal beer with the flavor of an IPA. And in my mind, the flavor of making an electrolyte beer would just be finding out like where you can push that level of electrolytes to, because I highly doubt it's to anything that's super reasonable.
Yep. So as for some more local news, Washington State is, I guess, doing a sort of rollback of openings. I don't know what you want to call it, but yeah, they're basically kicking everybody outside, which is very confusing on our part, but it sounds like starting this fall, coming up Friday, everyone will have to be seated outdoors now if they want to go out to places. So luckily for us, we have a fairly large patio here.
Outdoor seating. Our outdoor seating is better than our indoor seating, but still, not a lot of people want to be outside during a certain time, so that's going to be tough.
So it's going to be a really, really weird situation to be in, but that's, we're doing what we can here. It sucks for a lot of other places, though, because we know a lot of breweries in town that actually don't have patios or have very, very small patios to the point where they're...
Shack.
That doesn't have a bag in it. Okay. Small patios to where they've actually kind of been thinking about, is it even worthwhile to stay open at this point? But I think they can still do to-go stuff. So it's just going to be kind of another cut in the old back there. So
yeah, and
somebody said welcome to California.
Washington is also being a super, super family-oriented place by saying you can literally only sit with people that are a member of your same household.
Yeah, whatever that means.
So we're totally going to check that.
Yeah. Everybody wear a shirt that says you're from the same household.
Yeah, just wear matching shirts with everyone.
Yeah. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yep.
I'm with these guys. All right, and
so that's it
I
on.
think there's one more thing.
So you got an Omega Yeast. Oh, comment your favorite Omega Yeast.
Yeah.
By the way, just do that.
So all right, well I think that pretty much covers up our news for the week. So let's go right into our
Beer of the week. Bum bum bum. Beer of the week.
Totally did not make this one up this morning.
I'm actually excited for this one. This one's going to be, it's a really fun style.
I'm glad you thought of that one. That was good.
Yeah.
Anyway, what he's talking about is...
Last minute totally works.
21B, I believe, BJCP.
That's the specialty IPA category, which includes a lot of different IPAs, but this particular one that we're going to focus on is the white IPA.
So I like to call a white IPA the bastard child of what happened when somebody kicked a keg of wit beer and had a half pint of beer sitting there and said, screw it, let's top it off with a good old American IPA. Because really you are blending these two categories together to get something like a white IPA.
Yeah, so you've got some of the haze from a hazy IPA, but in none of the same ways that you want hazy IPA haze to come across. The haze in a white IPA is going to be rocky and fluffy, and it's going to fill out of the same boxes that you get from a nice highly carbonated white IPA because they're meant to push across like citrus and phenolic spice.
Yeah, exactly. And so the big note to hit on, so with this style of beer, is that you're getting some character from whatever Belgian yeast strain you're using. Sometimes that might be some fruity banana esters. Sometimes that might be some lighter peppery, some slight amount, and I say that very specifically, slight amount of clove quality to them. But because they are bittered pretty heavily, standards say 40 to 70 IBU, which is definitely up there. And for a fairly pale beer, other than some adjunct flaked malts in there, you actually have a nice dry crispy beer in the finish. So that's really I think what separates them from especially like our New World hazies is the yeast and the fact that finish is still going to be dry and crispy instead of being kind of thick and chewy. So yeah, let's just get right into it. The aroma, like I said, going to be fruity, going to be slightly spicy, can have some degree of phenol notes in there, but otherwise moderate. And then the flavor itself can vary quite a bit, actually. The flavor is going to be, a lot of times it's going to be a little bit bready, and it's going to have some fruity esters. A lot of times you'll get some orange notes from them. Sometimes this can actually be from orange peel. A lot of times this can come from the hop varieties themselves that you choose. And usually they'll have a slightly bitter, dry finish to them.
Yeah.
And then the mouthfeel is going to
full body,
generally be, well, full-ish. Full, but then because
not sweet, yeah. So they can finish kind of dry,
sweet,
but they're going to have that same puffiness, and like I said, that kind of rockiness that you get from
light body. So,
yeah.
So the body's not as full as you would expect, I guess.
I just think of full and like the puffiness, like if you go, it like puffs up in your mouth.
And then
high carbonation, like any wheat beer is going to have. So that high carbonation puts forward a lot of the phenolics that you get from yeast, which is what you're looking for.
And then some examples out there are going to be the one that always comes to my mind is Chain Breaker from Deschutes Brewing, and I believe
New Belgium makes an accumulation white IPA.
Yep, a New Belgian accumulation.
That's the ones that we've seen in the store. But of course, we're in the Northwest, which means we've got different
Harpoon,
different
the Long
offerings.
Thaw. That one I don't even know. So
I'm
sure that's an East Coast thing. But yeah, so that's kind of the quick breakdown. So let's go into our ingredients that we chose. So our malt of the week is going to be, I almost said wheat.
Malt of the week.
Flaked wheat.
Flaked wheat is a really fun one. It's got that that same kind of puffiness that you get off of malted wheat. It's got a lot of the same like flat bready flavors without being overly assertively grainy like rye can. And then flaked wheat will also have just a touch of kind of toasted quality from the gelatinization process. Not as much as like a torrefied wheat, but you get a little bit of that puffed maltiness.
Yeah, so you got to realize that these grain bills are going to be very, very simple. You're going to have probably just a light Pilsner malt or some kind of really light pale malt that you're working with, and then this flaked wheat, and that's pretty much it. You're really not, crystal malts have no place in these beers. You're going for a really light color to them. The color is supposed to be, wait for it, 6 to 14 SRM.
So that can actually go fairly to the light amber color.
A little bit dark.
6 is going to be that kind of like hay-y kind of quality. It's not as like crystal clear as a Cerveza or light Pilsner, but you're going to be in that same blonde to cream ale range on the lighter end, and then all the way to like a fair amber. Although my personal style would never get it that dark.
Mm-hmm.
Science.
So you're going to use a pretty high amount of flaked wheat in there. You're probably going to be using anywhere from maybe 2 to even up to about 4 pounds. These can have pretty high original gravities on them, up to 1070, which also I think is actually where you're getting some of those higher colors from. Or wait, am I looking at the right one? Hang on one sec.
What are you looking for?
I just looked at the rye. Oh, there it is, white. Never mind, hang on, hold the phone. Oh, 5 to 8. I was looking at rye. No wonder that seems so dark.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Backpedal for the color SRM. It is supposed to be 5 to 8.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot more sense to me.
I was like, that makes a lot more sense. I was like,
I was reading comments while you were doing that, so I wasn't going to fact check you on the time. Yeah, so 5 to 8. That's
OG's up to 1065, which also seems a little better. I'm like, wow, 1070 seems high. But one note is that the final gravities are between 1010 and 1016, which is also kind of a byproduct of using that higher amount of adjunct or flaked malts in there. You're going to end up with a higher finishing gravity.
Yeah.
And that's also where you're going to kind of get that
1016 I feel like would have a little bit of like puffiness.
Yeah, exactly. So like I said, 2 to say 4 pounds for a 5-gallon batch, kind of depending on your grain bill. But yeah, keep it simple for the grains. Throw in some flaked malts, throw in some flaked wheat, and call it good for that.
And let's go into our hop of the week. We wanted to kind of accentuate the fact that you can get a little bit of orange quality with this week's hop. We went with Idaho 7, which can have some tangerine and marmalade flavors.
Yeah, Idaho 7. We actually just did a video on this, but yeah.
It's a really fun hop.
Got a little bit of that tangeriness, got some herbalness. I think that herbal sort of mid-tone to it will actually balance just really well with any kind of phenolic yeast that you're going to throw at it. And so Idaho 7 would be the hop of choice. It is a fairly high alpha hop too. And
it's got a good amount of cobite, so it's a really good balancing hop if you're going to use it for like that West Coast style where you're hopping multiple times during the boil. But it also has tremendous and round tropical flavors that come when you do whirlpool it. So you can really kind of go on both ends to push forward the bright citrusy pop that you want from the orange component while having some complexity from tropical fruit that kind of make this beer more interesting.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be afraid to throw a healthy amount, somewhere in that range for a 5-gallon batch of even up to about a half pound of this.
8 ounces is my go-to for big flavorful IPAs.
Yep. I would hop it in the sort of style of a West Coast, where you've got your traditional bittering edition. You know, you're getting that 40 to 70 IBUs, and then probably something like a 15.5-ish flame out somewhere in there, and then a dry hop. So,
and to be a squid less on the whirlpool than you would get from like a juicy, where you're throwing 4 to 6 ounces in the whirlpool. This whirlpool can probably get by with just 2, maybe 3 ounces. You don't want to over juicify this because you want to lean the beer's flavor into that spiciness that you'll get from the yeast and from any adjuncts that you're going to use.
Exactly. So let's go on to I just pushed the wrong thing. Our speaking of which, our yeast of the week,
Yeah.
which is actually a blend that we kind of thought about today.
Yeah.
Let us know, by the way. Next week we're thinking about doing talking all about blending yeast and different ways to do that. But as for this, we went for a blend of Whiteout, which is your traditional wit beer strain, and then Joystick, which is the Pac-Man strain from Rogue. So that's your classic West Coast, just super, super neutral, super clean ale strain. And I believe, in my mind, the combination of those, what's going to happen is, for one, the beer's going to ferment like a beast. Mm-hmm. It'll probably be done in 3 days. But also, what you're going to do is you're going to take those really, really heavy clove, really heavy phenol characteristics of the Whiteout and actually mellow those out a little bit so they don't overpower the beer.
And you're going to lean those into a little bit of like kind of black and white pepper flavors instead of just that heavy clove and risking banana flavor that can happen if you have a Whiteout strain by itself, especially if that strain starts to get a little sluggish. And so that Joystick's going to help the whole beer rip through, and you'll get that kiss of nice spiciness off the wit beer strain without it distracting from all the flavors that you want to keep from the hops.
Yeah, I would avoid like some of the Weinstefan strain, like the Weinstefan wheat strain for a beer like this. I feel
like a blended wit strain.
Yeah, I feel like the bananas might get a little bit too overwhelming in the beer. I do think another alternative would be like the Ardennes strain, 3522 from Yeast could actually work pretty well.
Yeah.
But I think the bottom line is that throwing higher cell counts at this, and then throwing a more neutral strain to sort of balance out whatever Belgian strain you want to throw at this will actually get you that sort of hint of character without ending up with a beer that's like, woof, that's Belgian-y, and more or less pushing the beer into, instead of a white IPA, until just the straight Belgian IPA category. So that is, I believe, the trick to finding balance and really.
And let's go on to the adjunct of the week, which is something that we decided to add whenever it's appropriate. So the adjunct of the week for this is a really fun one that we've seen added in a couple of nice, really flavorful beers that are being brewed in Spokane, and that's peppercorns, mixed peppercorns to be specific.
Yeah, so peppercorns come in a huge variety of different, actually, colors and flavors. I know I've used black, I've used green, I've used white.
Pink. Pink is really common around here.
Yep. And that color as well.
Yep, all of the colors. We're writing each other secret messages on our.
Yes. So yeah, as for other adjuncts, we got peppercorns, and then like I kind of mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to throw some kind of zest or some orange peel, be it sweet, be it bitter. Have fun with it. The world's your oyster there. I feel like you can't really go wrong as long as you're not like getting excessive.
Yeah, you can go ahead and add a lot of bright flavors. Just don't add a lot of sweet flavors, first of all, and don't go overboard on anything that's going to be too distracting. But feel free to play around with some nice bright flavors.
Yeah, finally, for water chemistry, you're going to want to go for a fairly balanced water profile on this, if not leaning a little bit more towards that West Coast higher sulfate situation. I would say to pay attention to your mash pH, depending on how light and how simple your grain bill is going to be. You may have to add either some acidulated malt or a little bit of lactic acid to your mash, and again, all depends on your water. But yeah, so shoot for that overall balance profile, leaning a little bit more towards a higher sulfate to chloride ratio.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so that pretty much covers our beer of the week. Before we go on to topic number one, let's address something that's been kind of an ongoing thread. Thor Odinson asked something about getting a slightly tart flavor, it looks like, from adding apricots to a beer. This is where it's way up there. But he used a combination of fresh fruits and syrup, and it's got a weird taste. Someone asked, he mentioned he did pasteurize at 160. My question would be, did you freeze first? And my theory would be, with that fresh apricot flavor, if it's got a little bit of extra like tart sourness that you can't really explain, it could actually be from skins or cell walls that haven't completely broken down. Freezing and then pasteurizing will turn it into a nice sweet mush that actually makes it easier to get that apricot flavor in your beer. So I'm guessing it's not a sanitary issue because it sounds like it was pasteurized. 160, I think the pasteurization temperature or time is somewhere around 10 minutes. So if you go up to 180, that shortens down to like less than a minute. But my guess would be it has something to do with the cell walls or the skins giving you a little extra bite.
If he had pits in the apricots, it is possible that he actually got a little bit of tannins out of there too. So
yeah,
that might come across as that weird flavor as well. Which a little bit of tannin isn't a bad thing, but too much can definitely suck on this and you'll find out.
That was a threat, I think.
That was, yep. And
Let's go on to topic number 1, which is the importance of water in beer. Water is the largest ingredient by weight and volume that you'll add to beer. Maybe not by volume. By weight, for sure, the largest ingredient you'll add to beer. I'd have to look. What's more voluminous, the grain or probably the grain? Anyways.
Yeah, you're getting way too into that now. Anyway.
By weight, definitely the largest ingredient you're adding to beer. And in the final product, for sure, the most important ingredient that's in there. Water has different flavors, and those flavors do affect both how your mash goes, how your fermentation goes, and the base flavor of your beer.
Yeah, and yet it is almost always overlooked by, definitely for starting home brewers, and honestly for a lot of well-seasoned home brewers, they overlook water. They start worrying about, getting this hop and that hop and the alpha acids and, yeast starters, but they keep forgetting about water chemistry. So we are just going to go head on and address that elephant in the room today and sort of give you guys a simple breakdown of, general water and what it all means and how to work with it, right?
Yeah. So we've got a couple of main minerals that we're working with when it comes to water chemistry. The first is kind of the first one that you think about when it comes to mash pH, and that is a measure of the residual alkalinity or total hardness, and that's going to be the bicarbonate or chalk that's in your water. Yeah,
so chalk or bicarbonate, you'll also kind of see this as hardness is another thing that you'll see. And what this is this is going to give you flavor-wise in low quantities. It doesn't really do much for flavor, but in high quantities, it can actually give you that. Whenever somebody says a beer tastes minerally, that's going to be part of it, is having that chalk in there. And this varies widely depending on where you're at. I was just looking up one for Seattle, I guess, has actually super soft water.
Yeah.
Which was like 10 ppm of bicarbonate. Meanwhile, where I live, which is just outside of town here, we have almost 300 ppm of bicarbonate. So yeah, I get toilet rings in like 5 days out there.
And there's even a variation in because we moved 2 miles away and we're on a different well in this current location from our old location. And our old location was around 120 parts per million bicarbonate. And we haven't tested this water, but just by taking the pH, I noticed a huge difference. So I'm guessing we're closer to that, between 10 and 30 ppm of bicarbonate here. Either that or there's something that happens in line that softens our water, because our water here comes around 7 pH.
Yeah, it's definitely softer. Yeah, I think we're higher than that, but I definitely think we're well under 100 here compared to, I think we're probably 100 or if not higher over there.
Yeah, I had it measured out there. It was 120.
Yeah, I was like, that sounds about right. So this is also a double-edged sword, though. So the beauty of having bicarbonate, which is usually calcium carbonate or calcium bicarbonate, is that when it's dissolved in water, a lot of times you can break away those calcium ions, which mean that you can get great mash conversions, which is at my house. Mash conversions are amazing. But again, then you're left with that overall just intense minerality, which can be very beneficial to dark beers, but be very detrimental to anything that has a lot of hops in it, and anything that is a generally pale colored beer. So
they can add an actual minerally taste, which sometimes is really good if it's done in the right proportions, but if it's in too light of a beer, that minerally taste can turn a otherwise crisp and refreshing beer into a little bit of more of an aggressive, tongue scraping beer.
Yep, exactly. It's a tongue scraper. Yeah. So speaking of which, let's talk about dissolved calcium, because that's a really important one, specifically for our mashes.
Yeah. So calcium plays a couple of roles. One is actually in helping your enzymes do their job in the mash. It also reduces the residual alkalinity. So where bicarbonate is going to add raw alkalinity, calcium under the when it gets acidic can actually dissolve some bicarbonate, and that reduces the residual or not dissolve but combine with bicarbonate and reduce the residual alkalinity or the ability of your mash to buffer against pH. And so when you add gypsum, for example, or calcium chloride, you're making it so that the acids in your mash can change the mash pH more.
Calcium sulfate is what he meant to say.
Gypsum. I said gypsum.
Yeah. You said calcium chloride.
I said both of them. Yeah. Both of them have calcium in them.
Oh, well, yeah.
I'm talking about the calcium specifically.
You didn't say or in between.
I said gypsum or calcium chloride. Did I say that, guys? Let me know. I'm totally right. Logan's wrong. Anyways, either of them have calcium, and when dissolved calcium is in your mash, it first of all helps your enzymes, and second reduces your residual alkalinity, meaning your mash pH can change more with acid additions.
Exactly. So very important, especially if you're dealing with very soft water, like we mentioned, the Seattle water. So if you have soft water where you don't have high amounts of dissolved calcium, you actually need to add some degree of that in order to get some good conversion in your mash. Otherwise, what happens is those enzymes need it in order to convert their starches into sugars, and if they don't have it, they just have a really hard time going through that process.
Yeah, it's also going to be important for yeast health in your final beer, although there will be some levels of calcium and magnesium that you get from the grain themselves. Magnesium is much higher, and when it gets into the final beer, a ratio of 5 calcium to 1 magnesium parts is usually pretty good for overall yeast health, making sure that they aren't either multiplying or fermenting at different rates.
Yep. A general rule of thumb to shoot for dissolved calcium is about 70 ppm. That will max out all of your mashing abilities. So that is a good thing to kind of keep in mind.
For a balanced profile.
Yeah, for a balanced profile. Otherwise, let's go into sulfates and chlorides, right? Because these we've talked about these before, but they're arguably the most important thing when it comes to any kind of water chemistry. They definitely have a huge effect on literally brewing the same recipe, and just swapping these two can impact the flavor a lot. So
yep. So let's start with sulfates going with a higher sulfate ratio. Sulfate does the thing that you're probably most used to hearing now is that sulfate's going to add aggression and push forward your hop flavors a little bit more. And so that can be the sulfate being crazy high relative to the chlorides, like 10 to 1. Although I usually try to stick in the 5 to 1 ratio, unless my beer is stupidly minerally, in which case I like to try to keep it balanced somewhat. But I've seen sulfate as high as 300, 350 parts per million. In which case I do like to have my chlorides kind of up at maybe 50 to just kind of make sure it's not some ridiculous stretch.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm kind of on the same line of anything above. Yeah, when you start getting between 3 and 5, I think that ratio gets high enough that you really are pushing forward those hop sharp notes in a beer, and anything beyond that, you're kind of just wasting water salts.
Yeah.
So unless you really are trying to hit, a target profile.
So yeah, the sulfates, the thing you need to know, sulfates push forward hops, whereas chloride actually pushes forward malt or sweetness or body. And so a chloride ratio about even with sulfates gives you a nice balanced profile. And then when you get into things like a lot of lagers with a little bit more mouthfeel, or of course New Englands are the biggest culprit right now, that New England or hazy IPA, you'll be pushing those chlorides forward a little bit more.
Yeah, so chlorides are going to soften up the hop profile. They're going to push through some of that mouthfeel, some of that malty sweetness. And it's not the total amount of these, but it's rather the ratio between the two. So if you have a beer that's got 40 ppm of chlorides and 5 ppm of sulfates in there, then it's going to be very soft. Whereas if you've got a beer that's 50 ppm of chlorides and, like Peter said, 300 ppm of sulfates, it's actually going to be
relatively
quite sharp.
aggro.
Yes. So difference between styles, West Coast, if you want that sharpness. A lot of British beer styles, your stouts are also going to be have a little bit higher ratios, things like that, things like English bitters, and then for the soft beers, you got your new hazies. And then you've also got a lot of your traditional lagers. Yeah,
a lot of those lagers that like to push forward the malt feel. So like Helles lager is going to be more on this chlorides, whereas like a Pilsen lager, that's going to be slightly pushing on the sulfates, but it's going to be a relatively soft overall beer, not very many minerals.
Yep.
Something that goes with chlorides, kind of along the same vein of building body and mouthfeel, and also perceived sweetness, and it's an underutilized mineral. It's a mineral not a lot of people think about, but it is sodium. Sodium chloride is obviously the most common way to get sodium or chloride in your beer, and it's very, very common in like German styles for them to have relatively high, 50, 60, 80 parts per million of sodium. But I see a lot of people when they're building up profiles here in America, they use calcium chloride all the time, and so their calcium gets really high, their chloride gets really high, and then sodium's like 0 because our sodium in our water is nil.
Yep. Yeah, so sodium actually has this little, this small effect on mouthfeel, and if you've ever had, true German beers, really in general, I would say they have this roundness to them. And I like to contribute that to the sodium in the water. And it doesn't take much. A little bit goes a long ways.
Yeah.
But having that there can actually give you a sort of roundness that you just miss out on, regardless of what you're doing with it. We do not sell it here, though. And that's because you already have it.
Yeah, you can get it anywhere. You don't want to use iodized.
Table salt.
Non-iodized salt. So yeah, sea salt, table salt, pink Himalayan salt. Anything that's non-iodized is going to work for you to get that sodium in there. And another way to think about it is you think about the same reason that you put sodium on food. I mean, sodium is a flavor enhancer. So what it does is it reduces the energy of activation that your taste buds require to perceive certain compounds, and it makes it so that you taste things a little bit more aggressively for things that are already there. For the same reason, in relatively light beers, a little bit of sodium can go a long way. Where you're trying to really search for all those flavors in the beer, that tiny bit of extra sodium is going to help you perceive those more strongly and pick out the delicate nuances of the beers, also while building that mouthfeel and overall flavor.
Exactly. So, and then lastly, one I kind of threw on here, which typically it is important, but you're not really going to have to deal with it a whole lot, but that's going to be magnesium. So magnesium is found in Epsom salt. So that's just another water chemistry kind of tool at your disposal. Typically you'll see this in pretty low quantities, but what most people don't realize is you actually get a lot of this from grains themselves.
Yes, magnesium is very common in grains. It's basically the biggest reason that you need magnesium in beer is going to be your yeast health, but it's not something that I worry about too much. And so that 5-to-1 ratio is what you want in your final beer. But if your calcium in your water is already relatively low, then it's not really something you have to worry about terribly. So I wouldn't think too much about trying to put, Epsom salt, for example, in your mash, unless you have zero magnesium and your calcium's up at like that 120 parts per million, something super, super high. Then it becomes an issue. Yeah.
So what I generally tell people is not to worry a whole lot about magnesium if you're using city water. Most city water will have enough magnesium to get you where you need to be. But if you are building up a water profile from scratch, it's definitely a good idea to get a little bit in there. So if you're using, distilled water or RO water and actually building up a profile exactly, you'll see in most water profiles too, it's going to vary a lot, but almost all of them have at least a little bit of magnesium in there as well. So
let's talk about one more trace mineral that not a lot of people think about whether or not it is in their water, and that it is really important for yeast health, and that is zinc. Zinc is a vitamin that some waters have and some waters don't. I don't think about too much when I'm building up a water profile, obviously, but one thing that I do always do is add yeast nutrient to my wort, just to make sure that my yeast have that going into the final beer. So if you add yeast nutrient that has zinc in it, then you don't have to worry about whether or not it's in your water. But just one more quick tidbit.
Sounds good. Oh, sorry. Hitting the mic. And then next let's talk a little bit about the pH of your water, because like I mentioned in our beer of the week, that can be an issue if you are brewing really light or really dark beers, and depending on if you've got really soft or really hard water to work with.
Yep. You're talking about pH of water. The first one you have is pH of the beer. You're talking about pH of water or beer?
Well, it affects the beer too.
Final pH will affect the beer. Let's start with mash efficiency, because that's the first part that pH will come in to play.
Yeah.
So pH affects the enzymes that work in your beer. There are several different enzymes that are at work that come naturally from the grains to make sure that you get proper conversion and the right sugars out of your grains. And kind of that optimum pH range is 5.2 to 5.4. However, there are some protein-based enzymes that work really well at a lower temperature. So, for example, protease enzymes, a lot of those will work really well at like 4.6 all the way up to 5.1. So a little bit under that 5.2 isn't the end of the world, but I don't like to go too much under that 5.1, because a lot of alpha and beta amylase start slowing down under that pH. And so if you have that kind of 5.1 to 5.3 pH range, you're in a really good spot no matter what you're mashing. If you're mashing with a protein rest, you might consider going a little bit under, but again, you don't want to go too much under where you're not letting your alpha and beta amylase do their work.
Yeah, so most people will have fairly high pH water, which means that if you're brewing a very light beer, you're going to have to add some kind of acid addition to adjust for that. It means that the grains themselves aren't going to have enough buffering impact. They're not going to have enough natural acidity to keep up, which means that you might suffer from losses in your mash efficiency. It means that you're not going to get a full conversion rate. Luckily, that's pretty easy. That can be done with lactic acid or acidulated malt is by far the easiest way. Investing in a half decent pH meter is honestly, they're reasonable now. What are they, like $30 to get a half
You can get a pretty solid one for $30.
Yeah, for half decent pH meter. It's not a bad idea. For dark beers, the darker the malt, the more acidic that malt is naturally. So they're actually going to have a lot more impact on if you're using a water that, say, has a 7.8 pH to begin with, or something like that, as well as a lot of reserve alkalinity, which is kind of its own thing, but we'll omit that for this conversation.
Yeah.
So dark beers a lot of times will have that natural impact of lowering the pH of your mash. So if you happen to be at home, you're brewing light beers, you seem to not have nearly as good of efficiency compared to your dark beers, that's probably a water pH problem.
Yeah.
So definitely kind of dive into that, maybe invest in a pH meter.
Or on the opposite end, when you do dark beers, if you get less efficiency, that could be your water's already pretty
you have softer
acidic,
water, and you're
dark beer's
you're too
undershooting.
acidic on the mash.
Yeah.
Which in that case, you'll actually want to add more
bicarbonate
of your bicarbonate. Yeah, I was going to say you want to buffer that with adding more bicarbonate to your water, which makes sense. If you got soft water, it can use a little bit extra bicarbonate anyway. So,
speaking of adding bicarbonate to your water to alkalinize it, let's talk about how your strike water can impact the pH of your strike water can impact mineral solubility. Because one thing that you might notice if you have like really hard water or alkaline water is when you go to boil up your strike water, all of a sudden you see some precipitate in the bottom of your strike water kettle or your hot liquor tank.
Yeah, that's actually going to be your bicarbonate falling out of solution. Pre-acidifying that can actually really reduce that. Like I said, out of my house, 300 ppm, that's way too high for most beers. My quick and dirty solution is just to dilute it with store-bought water.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that option, or if you're just trying to get things done real quick, you can actually pre-acidify your water, boil it up, let it cool off just a little bit, and a lot of that bicarbonate will fall out. What I've read is it generally drops down to right around 100 ppm. When you do that, it's called slaking, I think is the technical term for that.
Sure.
But yeah, and that's also whenever you see a traditional recipe that mentions decarbonated water, that's exactly what they're talking about. Is you're pre-boiling the water, you're getting those bicarbonates to drop out, and you're getting it down closer to about 100 ppm. So that is definitely a trick to be used when you're trying to brew a lighter, softer beer.
Yeah. All right, so pH. Let's talk about how pH affects your the softness or sharpness of your hop flavors. So in general, basically, the lower the pH, which we can get this just by again a little bit of acidulated malt in our mash. The more you're doing to lower your pH, that can actually help boost the flavor profile, the sharpness of your hops, or the kind of citrusy tones of your hops. And we do this pretty commonly with a little bit of acid malt.
Yeah, it has a huge effect actually. To where you can take a sort of almost piney West Coast profile hop and turn it into, what I like to call the pineapple bombs, right? And that's just by making a beer, adding a little bit more acid malt, usually later to your boil, and dropping that pH by, only maybe dropping it down from, say, final pH of around 4.8 to 4.4, somewhere in there.
Oh, not even that much.
Those are kind of arbitrary numbers, but
it wouldn't be that big of a difference in the final product. But
by dropping that down, you can really change the way a hop comes across, and that's just because you're starting to get those thresholds of acidity. And so now all of a sudden a hop that might have been piney comes across as very citrusy, because citrus fruits naturally have acid associated with them.
The way especially with lactic acid, the way that your mouth perceives lactic acid directly versus the way that your mouth perceives hops when the hops are impacted by lactic acid, those thresholds are different. So you don't necessarily have to add enough lactic acid to get your beer tart to have it impact your hop profile.
Yeah. The opposite thing can actually happen when we dry hop a beer too. When you dry hop a beer, hops themselves are naturally alkaline, so they end up actually raising the pH a little bit, and that can actually push through more bitterness, which is another interesting thing.
Yep.
So if you ever have a beer that you're tasting when it's young, it's kind of pre-dry hop, and you're saying, it's a little bit sweet, a little bit too much body. I wish that was a little bit more assertive on the bitterness. Maybe try upping your dry hop addition a little bit just to raise that pH a little more for you. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how much more bitter that beer actually tastes after dry hopping.
Yeah.
So,
anything else for the pHs?
yeah. So, and then the only other thing for
Oh,
pH, which is going to be sort of it's not necessarily a starting water thing so much as a final water thing, and something that we've actually kind of played around with here is different yeast strains. If you're doing a sour beer that you're purposely souring your mash, you're purposely putting lactobacillus in there to sour that, is that if the pH does drop too low, a lot of yeast strains actually can't handle it, and it'll actually cause either a stuck fermentation, or it'll significantly slow down their fermentation. And that's why the general rule of thumb that you'll see whenever people are doing sour beers are stick with German ale strains. Kind of variety of those, even Kolstrain, I think, is actually
Yeast temperature.
pretty pH tolerant. But
That's the word I'm looking for. I'm trying to temperature, yeast tolerant,
yeah.
words.
So yeah, but typically a German ale strain. Those ones are naturally acid tolerant, so those are your best choices for doing especially heavy sours. So yeah, and I think that kind of sums up all of our water chemistry. So let's go on to topic number 2, which we have so lovely labeled ascorbic acid and other acids too.
Yeah. I don't know if we have a ton of time to go over a ton of different acids, just because...
We'll give you the quick rundown on them.
The quick rundown. All the acids that we'll add in beer, and then we'll go into off-flavor acids, which are off-flavors that you might not know about, what we titled this whole thing.
Yeah.
So ascorbic acid, as you guys have heard before, we use in every one of our beers. It is a natural antioxidant. It is known as vitamin C in the real world, and it is something that can be a good preservative, especially when you're making hazy or New England IPAs. To give you a rundown, what we do in all our 5-gallon batches of beer, that's all our 19-liter batches of beer, is we add between 3 and 5 grams, and we put them into our mash. Now, a lot of people will tell you that ascorbic acid will degrade when it's in higher temperatures. But the thing that we find it helps with is it reduces reactive oxidant species early on, and those are the species that are precursors to oxidation happening. So by reducing reactive oxidant species, it makes a more stable beer in the final product. And so that's why we added it into our mash. It seems to work. There's very little science to back that up, but we've done side-by-sides and it works. Yeah. The correct way that pro brewers do it is they add it at packaging, but there's a lot of mixed science about whether or not it actually works when adding it at packaging. So when people are asking about it, we say technically add 3 to 5 grams when you package or during fermentation, but what we do is we add it in our mash.
Yep. So, yeah, and you actually did find an article on that too. So,
several articles.
Yeah. So an article about how it affects different impact in the mash versus at packaging is ultimately what it comes down to. We have been adding it to our mash. I think it stabilizes the beer. It keeps the hops fresher for longer, and just really, I think, like Peter said, it's keeping those natural things that are going to try to oxidize within the beer after packaging. It takes them out in the mash step, so they never have a chance to actually get in the package.
And before you look up the very first article on what vitamin C is or what ascorbic acid is, it's really important that you know that there are actually 2 types. So the most common one is basically one that's binded to sugar, and that is a very stable version of ascorbic acid. And then there's the standard ascorbic acid, which is the basically the dissolvable in water ascorbic acid, and that one is the one that will degrade at higher temperatures. And so if you took your packet of ascorbic acid and you microwaved it, it's going to not turn into ascorbic acid. But if you add it to your mash, it has more longevity.
Yep. Next, let's talk about lactic acid. This is probably what you've heard of when you work out and it gets in your muscles, but also it has some fantastic uses in beer. The easiest and simplest use is for pH adjustments. Adding a few drops to your mash is usually all you need if you got a highly concentrated version of lactic acid. and that will help adjust mash pH, but also you can use it as a quick and dirty souring method.
Yeah, so lactic acid is the most common byproduct of lactobacillus, or the same stuff that makes your yogurt. And it has a relative sweetness when used in a concentration where you can taste it, but obviously being an acid, it's also very tart. It also has a relatively high flavor threshold, meaning you can add a decent amount of it before you can actually taste it.
Yeah. So next, let's talk about phosphoric acid. Phosphoric acid is quite a bit less common, but we use it. I mean, we primarily actually use it for cleaning stuff more than anything else. But phosphoric is a very strong acid.
It's a strong acid, again, with a high flavor threshold, meaning you can use a decent amount of it before tasting it, which is why it's good for pH adjustment.
Yeah.
Both lactic and phosphoric acids are relatively strong acids, which is why we use them for pH adjustment. But phosphoric acid definitely doesn't taste very good when you have it in a flavor threshold level.
I think the best use for phosphoric acid, especially when it comes to like water chemistry type stuff, would be when you're in that situation. If you have really high water, you want to drop that pH in the water from the get-go. And because of its potency, I think phosphoric acid is a good choice for that.
Yep. It's also, before you people, someone got into an argument with me a while ago when we were talking about using Star San and don't fear the foam or something like that. And they're like, linked all these articles like phosphoric acid decreases bone density. Any acid will do that at a high enough concentration. Luckily, it's never going to be at that concentration in beer.
So does acetic, but you know.
Yeah, well, literally any acid does it.
All right, and let's go on to citric acid. This is kind of a fun one. Can be good and bad.
So citric acid is a weaker acid, meaning to get to any sort of pH adjustment with citric acid, you will pass the flavor threshold. That said, the flavor threshold of citric acid doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be bad unless it's too aggressive.
Yeah, I think citric acid can be fantastic if you are doing what we like to call instant sours here, where you're actually adding it to a finished beer to turn that beer into a sour beer. I think a combination of both lactic and citric acid give you more complexity than just having the lactic acid in general. So citric acid is fun. Like Peter said, it does actually have a flavor associated with it. I think you can all guess what that flavor is going to be. Sort of that lemon lime is kind of like what I like to describe it as. And so adding that with some lactic acid gives you more complexity in a sour beer. You can play around with it too. We've actually made some beer cocktails. Are they mocktails? Is that what you call them?
Sure.
Beer cocktails with citric acid as well. And it can also help kind of cut through sweetness if you end up with a beer that's going to be really sweet and you want to sort of turn that into a sour for yourselves.
Yeah, let's talk about acetic acid next. Acetic acid is vinegar. It's commonly made by Acetobacter in mixed culture beers, but it can also just be a byproduct of leaving your beer open and getting a fermentation that you don't expect, an infection. Acetic acid, or Acetobacter, the bacteria that makes acetic acid, is very, very common in nature. If you were to smash up some cabbage, for example, it would turn into vinegar because Acetobacter is already there. But yeah, it's very, very aggressive, and it tastes funky, but it can also taste very good if used in the right proportions.
Yeah, acetic acid is something that you should never be adding to beer, but it is something that you can find in beer. I think the great examples are Flanders Red and Ode Bruin style sours. So if you ever have a sour that's just lays you on your butt, odds are it's full of acetic acid. I like to say that it hits you way, way in the back. Is where the acetic acid will hit you, whereas the lactic's a little bit forward in your mouth. And so that is another acid. And then also something that you shouldn't run into in beer, but might if it's barrel aged, is going to be malic acid.
Malic acid is very common in apples and pears, but it can also be a very aggressive acid. So in apples and pears, malic acid gives you that kind of tart bite that you get. Things that have that in higher concentrations are obviously going to be like Granny Smith. Combination of malic acid and tannic makes Granny Smith great for pies, but not so optimal for eating all the time. And yeah, it's just kind of an aggressive, it's the acid on the outside of warheads, if that is a good explanation.
Yep. So but yeah, these are all fun to play with. I think they all have their place. Like the later ones, more so if you're playing around with different sour type beers. I think a combination of more than one of those will actually end up leading to a better beer. Otherwise, most of them should be out of beer unless you are just doing water adjustments for your pH. So those are the common acids that you're going to find in beer and going to use in beer. So should we go on to the...
Yes.
We should? Okay. So let's talk about some other acids that you definitely, hang on. Yeah, definitely do not want in beer.
Yeah.
I'm like making sure that there's not anything that's good in there.
The next ones are off-flavored acids. These are acids that are always considered an off-flavor in beer. They do not taste great. And somebody already asked what is one of the most common reasons for that homebrew flavor. One of these I would definitely put on the list. But let's talk about the first one, which you can get a lot more commonly when you're doing sours, because there's a period during sours where you have kind of a more open environment before you add your yeast, and your yeast need to be competitive to keep out infectious bacteria like Clostridium.
I'm sure some of you are already knowing exactly where we're going with this.
And that is butyric acid. Butyric acid is baby puke acid. It smells
not just
like
baby, it's puke in general.
Yeah, it's more pungent in baby. You can smell it. Everyone has that. They understand where it comes from. It most commonly comes from an infection of Clostridium. If you do not pre-acidify your mash or worts to under 4.4 is probably good, but 4.2 is kind of that hard line where it can't get in there. But it can also be caused by some lactobacillus strains. However, that is less common.
Yeah, so Clostridium is going to be by far the most common. You're probably wondering, well, where does that come from? It comes from the grains. It is all over your grains.
Yep.
So yeah, especially if you're trying to inoculate with some grains. That's why we definitely shoot on that high temp range as well. It tends to knock that out and favor the lactobacillus when you're, trying to sour a beer at 110 to 120 degrees versus down at say 90. That's when you start kind of getting into that danger zone where you definitely risk the chance of Clostridium getting into that.
Yeah, so when making sour, this can also come in regular beers. If it comes in regular beers, it definitely is a Clostridium or lactobacillus infection, but just with poor pHs. So if you have it in regular beers, so clean brew house practices can make it so that you never have it in regular beers, but it's much less common in those than it is in sours.
Yeah. And then we can also talk about isovaleric acid. Sounds like we're from Game of Thrones here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Valerian steel.
Here comes isovaleric. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, everyone gets where you're going with that. Isovaleric acid is common from Brett infections. That's probably the most easy way to get it if you don't have a highly hopped beer. But it is also common in oxidized hops. And so if you have like old hops that start to smell cheesy, isovaleric can be that. And then what that is, isovaleric, is it's kind of like a cheesy, rancid foot smell.
Yeah, it's that classic like weird old beer flavor. And it's kind of par for the course. It comes hand in hand with I think just old oxidized beer as well. It kind of makes sense, I guess, with if your hops are oxidizing and you got old IPA that's oxidized, you might get that weird cheesy grassiness associated with it.
Yep. And then last, let's talk about caprylic acid. Caprylic acid is actually one that I think is more common for that homebrew kind of flavor if you have caprylic acid in your beer. It's kind of got an oily or goat-y kind of flavor, so just a little bit like weird, but maybe you can't fully explain why. And the best way to avoid it is just have a healthy fermentation. Yeah,
exactly. It's yeast stress or just not very healthy yeast in general. That's generally when that acid is going to be produced. So again, it's like practice what you preach. Starters, big pitches.
Yep.
That's the way to go always.
And the other side to homebrew flavors, because somebody asked homebrew flavors, I would say is kind of goes along the same way of get a healthy fermentation, is just unintentional sweetness.
Yeah.
That's not from caprylic acid, but unintentional sweetness can go away if you have a healthy fermentation, because first of all the sugars will be fermented out of your beer. And then the other thing is sometimes when yeast are under stress, if you don't have a really healthy pitch, then those yeasts that are under stress can produce some esters that kind of give you a perceived sweetness that isn't fantastic.
All right. Well, let's open her up to some general questioning real fast here. We went a little bit longer today, but send in your questions and we will answer them for you.
What's the best hop to use for a crushable smash IPA? Lots of them.
Oh my God.
Azaka, we just mentioned that one in the most recent live stream.
Mandarina Bavaria.
Idaho 7. All the ones we just mentioned. Mandarina Bavaria takes a little bit more technique to be as good because it's
light. Do an IPK like we did. It's been selling really well.
It is a really good beer.
Yeah. Kolsch yeast, simple grain bill. All hops in the whirlpool, and then whatever you want to throw in there.
Amazon is evil. We've got someone saying that. Super cool.
Amazon.
People are against 5.2 pH stabilizer. I am too. If you have the ability to keep it out of your beer by just doing standard water chemistry?
I think we kind of same thing. It's easy enough that if you're worried enough about water chemistry that you're worrying about pH, it's probably easier just to figure out what your water chem is and do a few drops of lactic acid in there.
And the mash pH is not the most important part of water chemistry. That's where 5.2 kind of gets off. Like I know a lot of people use it for the right mash pH, but you're changing so many other flavors.
Definitely.
Someone asks, if you use 2 yeasts for the beer, do you co-pitch or pitch the clean finishing yeast a day or 2 later? Depends on what I'm going for. So with the example today, I would actually probably make 2 starters and pitch them simultaneously.
Yep.
For other strains, like if I'm doing a co-pitch with Brett or something that I really want to accentuate funky flavors that not necessarily would be made in a co-pitch, then I might pitch them a day or 2 later. It also kind of depends on if the yeast is competitive.
Yeah, I always do it with saisons myself. I will always do a Belgian saison, which is notorious for stalling out, and let that ferment for, like Peter said, 3 or 4 days, and then actually pinch a French saison yeast after that, just to ensure that finishes out while still getting those awesome bubblegummy flavors from the Belgian yeast. All right, and I just saw another question on here about racking beer onto a yeast cake, yay or nay? Definitely yay. Do consider, you want to have like beer going onto like beer for one, and you want to make sure that's a nice fresh yeast cake. You probably don't want to be racking your American Pale Ale onto a yeast cake from an Imperial Stout, for obvious reasons. But for the most part, you're going to have tons and tons of healthy yeast. So I've done that with great results in the past.
Someone's asking, what gravity should I expect in a second beer from 30 pounds in a 5-gallon batch? Entirely depends on what you're going for with your first runnings beer. This question is talking about a party guile. So a 5-gallon batch, 30 pounds is very, very high. If you're probably going for a 1 quart of water per pound of grain ratio. You want a thick mash for sure with that. And what I would say is you just take the runnings from that, trying to do some quick calculations, just the runnings. 30 pounds, 1.3, you're losing about 4 gallons of water, and you put in 30 quarts, that's 7, so you have 3. So you probably get by 1.25 quarts of water per pound of grain in that, and then just take all the runnings from that, boil it down. On your second runnings, your sparge on that, you're probably still going to get 1.050. There's going to be a lot of grains left on that. A lot of sugars left on the grains. In a finished beer that I overshot pH, could I raise the pH back to where I want it with baking soda? I wouldn't use baking soda. Depends on the difference. Dry hopping will raise your pH slightly. I would probably use calcium bicarbonate instead of baking soda.
Yeah.
It's going to dissolve really well because beer is going to be acidic post-fermentation.
Yeah, a lot of those hacks aren't always the best just because they're not designed to be dissolved a lot of times in the beer.
It also depends on how much sodium you want in your beer, I guess. But
yeah,
I'd have to do the calculations to figure that out.
Pineapple. Clean, sanitize hot bag or grain bag. Shouldn't need to sanitize any bags that are being boiled. But it's not a bad idea to sanitize a hot bag if you're going to be dry hopping with it. So. We got a good one from Matt actually asking about a strong rubbery flavor in a beer that he fermented with 3470 under pressure. He thinks it might be the hot fermentation. I am thinking more along the lines of a water issue myself. Rubbery is kind of that's a weird one. If it's like that sort of Band-Aid flavor though, that's probably you somehow got some chlorine in there. So as I'm getting really close to the mic, sorry everybody. But yeah, I'm thinking that's probably a chlorine issue. It could be a contamination issue. Rubbery's a weird one. It could also be oxidization, which would be another one. I know we've gotten some kind of weird, sweet, meaty rubber kind of characteristics from oxidization in the past.
Yeah, I was just looking up one of the acids that causes that meaty flavor. It has to do with, there's another byproduct of both Brett and certain strains of lactobacillus that can cause that meaty off flavor. Depends on if it's rubbery or meaty. It could be
Yeah.
It's a different type of butyric acid. That's not the baby puke butyric acid, but it's a bound butyric acid that's common byproduct of lactobacillus and Brett fermentation that causes kind of a meaty, sometimes sweet flavor as well.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say. If it's rubbery, we usually attribute that to like garden hose or...
I was going to say, for all you that are still tuning in, too, notice that we don't immediately jump to it's infected because more times than not, from our experience, from our customers coming in and asking for, troubleshooting advice, that's very rarely the case that the beer itself is actually infected. Almost always it is a sort of methodology process issue along the line.
Yeah.
So.
Someone asks, can I add ascorbic acid when I bottle my homebrew? Absolutely.
Yep, sure can. It's not going to hurt nothing. Somebody's asking about having issues carbonating in a uni vessel without a spunding valve. The spunding valve is going to be the good way to go. I would say at least have a pressure gauge on there so you know what you're working with, and then also make sure that you have a relief valve on there. I do know that the SS uni tanks are not designed to have a ton of pressure, and then obviously you won't get any carbonation if you don't have that tank crashed as well. So I would say make sure that you've got the beer in that tank when you're trying to carbonate as cold as possible, and then 12, 13 psi should be about all you need.
You might have to calculate the weight rated PSI that you need because the rate at which your CO2 is going into your tank does take into effect the pressure that your CO2 is going in through your carb stone or through the bottom of your tank will be rated depending on the weight of the beer. So if you have a certain kind of constriction based on the size of the hole in your diffusion stone, and then you have a certain weight that's on top of that, there's actually a calculation you have to do to make sure that CO2 is still going into the beer.
It's a 1 barrel. It's like half a PSI.
No. Well, I don't know. 1 barrel, you should still be...
I think it's 1 PSI every 3 feet.
So someone says, we have some people that asked early on about acid malt. So it's not common, contrary to common belief, it's not just malt that's coated in lactic acid. It's actually naturally fermented. Mm-hmm. And so what they do is they soak it in a way that it's slightly moist on the outside of the grain, and they let the naturally occurring lactic acid producing bacteria make acids on the malt, and then they kind of stop that through the kilning process, and then you've got both, but they don't kill the acid the bacteria. So you still have both bacteria and multitude of acids, most commonly of which is lactic acid on the outside of the grain. So acid malt, I find, is a more complex acidity to add to beer if you're just going to do a fake kettle sour, but it's got lactic acid on it.
There must be another maltster that sprays, because we've had that question pop up a lot for us. And,
well, I think there's people that just think it is. I don't think there's
we use Best Malt's acidulated malt, and it is definitely not sprayed. There might be some other maltster that sprays it, but because I've had that question so many times, and it's like, no, that's not how that works. So definitely a good question, though. So glad to get that.
What's the biggest off-flavor myth we feel like we've busted? I think that's got to be secondary, using a secondary.
Yeah. Wait, off-flavor myth?
Yeah, so do you have to transfer to a secondary?
Oh, yeah, that's not necessarily an off-flavor, though.
Well, for, what's the polyphenols?
Chlorine?
Polyphenols from secondary. No, polyphenols, yeast skins, whatever you call those. My brain is flaking.
Yeast skins?
Whatever you know what I'm saying, autolysis, that's the one.
Oh, autolysis.
Yeast exploding.
Don't let your yeast cake sit for months on end and all the yeasties die.
But you don't have to do a secondary.
Yeah, no need for a secondary.
You missed the point of the question.
Okay.
What's the biggest off-flavor myth we feel like we've busted?
Oh, I gotcha. Off-flavor myth. I'm trying to think. I don't know. Don't know.
I don't think either of our brains are working right now. I think autolysis from secondary for your standard batch of beer is definitely the one. People, if you are going from primary, if you're sitting in primary for probably even 2 months or less, there's really not a risk unless there's high acidity, a lot of temperature swings, or unless you have a large fermentation vessel like barrels.
Yeah. All right. I think that's about it for questions. Somebody's saying they need beersmith training. And yeah, all right. Well, let's wrap this guy up for today. And thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next week at 8:45 Pacific Standard Time. And thanks again for tuning in the podcast. Give us a like. I see there's only 34 likes. Thank you guys so much. We will check back with you next week. Done?
Yeah, I'm just reading a bunch of people that are commenting below.
Oh, yeah, now they're all doing it.
The biggest myth you busted is usually infections causing off flavors. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's probably it. I mean, that's...
Yeah, there's a lot of other things.
Infections are so rare.
Let's try to make Peter laugh.
You're throwing 200 billion yeast cells at a beer.
You're a yeast
200 billion yeast cells. I could like dunk my dog into the beer and still probably have a beer that doesn't get infected. Don't make me do that, by the way.
Dogs can't swim in beer. All right.
As it like cuts out right there.